Welcome to the Book Binge. I'm your host, King Crusoe. You can call me KC, and way back in February, there was a Sony State of Play video that got me pretty excited for some of the upcoming video games that we're going to be releasing, at some point over the next couple of years, basically. State of the current gaming industry aside, there was one particular game showcased in that State of Play that caught my attention in a unique way. That was a game under the current, project title. Project Windless is what it's called, but that is based on the world of a book series by Lee Young-do called The Bird That Drinks Tears, the first part of which being called Heart of the Nhaga, which is the topic of today's video. When I realized that Project Windless was based on a book world, I went and looked into it a little bit because I do have this main channel where I talk about a bunch of books, and realized that the conceit was really interesting, and also learned that the book series is being translated into English for the very first time at the moment. This first book just came out this past June 2026, so very recently, and book 2 comes out in January of 2027, about 7 months afterwards. So presumably a similar type of schedule, approximately half a year gap in between, will also be true for the third and fourth books, which will definitely be a good thing for reasons that we'll get to in due time for this video. But I don't know, it caught my attention in a pretty standout way, and that made me willing to read Heart of the Nhaga basically immediately once I got it. I did so alongside a friend, and we had a good time. We definitely had a good time. So let's use the rest of this video to talk about my thoughts on Heart of the Nhaga. We'll start off just like I normally do with the good of the book, and there are definitely two very markedly notable things about this book, and presumably the series at large, that I think are worth checking it out for by themselves. The first one of those things is some of the world building ideas. The world building is surprisingly evocative, despite being, relatively little of the focus of this actual book. There are certain ideas within there, and certain setting-based dynamics that are very effectively utilized, and also just introduced. There's a lot of cool introductions to stuff that is going on in this book that are just like, I like these ideas. These ideas are interesting. Some of those ideas are, put forth by the blurb, so to speak, of the book in ways that I, again, think are very effective and just like, catch the attention. They draw the eye, so to speak. Many of those ideas are maybe not super deeply expanded upon within the book, like I said, but you get a drop and go type of situation where you're never overwhelmed by gritty details that are more or less meaningless for somebody who doesn't know anything about the book, but they're still intriguing. You are always intrigued by the ideas that are on display. Related to that world building, and honestly the best part of the book, is the culture-based stuff. So the cultural dynamics that are being built in the book are related to the world building, like I said, in certain ways, but it is its own thing. The culture stuff is the best part of Heart of the Nhaga, in my opinion. So what does that come down to in the context of this book? Well, there are 4 races of people. So basically 4 sentient humanoid, essentially, races of people. And all of those are very unique from one another. There's the humans, the Takabi, presuming I'm pronouncing that horribly, the Rakon, and the Nhaga. So humans are humans, understandably enough. You don't need that explained to you very much. The Takabi are very enlightened race of people, inspired directly by Korean folklore, apparently, but they seem to maybe draw a certain influence from generally familiar ideas within East and Southern Asian mythology to certain degrees. The Rekon are large, bird-like people. They're definitely an intense warrior variety of a race. And then the Nhaga are a more reptilian, legitimately cold-blooded race of people with definitely the most interesting cultural stuff belonging to them specifically. Easily my favorite part of the book was learning about the Nhaga and what's going on within their culture, but the other cultures also have some very interesting ideas, although they're not focused on quite as much. The Heart of the Nhaga being the title is a pretty appropriate title for many ways, or for many reasons, I suppose, in many ways, depending on how you want to think about it. To say that, well, to say much more about the actual races, about the cultures, and some of the interesting ideas in display feels like it's halfway cheating you out of the joy of learning about it from the book itself. Needless to say, or maybe not needless to say, suffice it to say that the cultural stuff within this book is easily the most compelling part of it, and frankly, the reason why I would recommend the book. It's really interesting and cool stuff. I had very enjoyable time just with the world building and culture ideas of the book. More so than just the world building and the culture stuff, there's also the specific interactions between some of those cultures that makes for a particularly interesting reason to read Heart of the Nhaga, in my opinion. I love the variety on display. I talked about the variety within those different races themselves, but there's also different types of variety within the book that aren't just between those four humanoid sentient races, right? There's also, the handful of major characters, and all of those characters are so distinct from one another, not just because of their different races, but because of their personalities. Even within different races, there's a substantial amount of variety on display here. It never felt like I was getting any one character confused with another because of their general attitude or their personality or anything like that. So there's a huge amount of variety on offer there between those handful of major characters. There are also some pretty distinct traits that are given to each of those races and each of those people in and of themselves that are generally just very easy to identify, right? You're not going to get confused between characters because they have that distinct aspect to them. Some of those things might feel a little bit like token to an extent, but I do think that Lee handles the material great. What I mean by that, by the token comparison, is like some of those differences between certain characters or whatnot might feel relatively arbitrary, or more like you're just sticking a random character trait onto a character to make them different. But because those traits are utilized within the plot in ways that are meaningful to, the moving forward of the story and more importantly, the journey that is happening within the book, it's not a problem. Like it's never a problem because, like I said, they're not just token. Being token would mean they exist just to exist, and it's not actually useful or doesn't actually do anything besides identifying the character. No, the various different traits of these races and these cultures and of the individual characters are important, actually. So that is something that makes them effective here. You have a huge amount of variety, and they're not there just to be there. They actually serve some kind of purpose. I hope that made some sort of sense. Anyway, another thing that I really liked about The Heart of the Nhaga was that I was a big fan of not just the variety within the characters and whatnot within the races. I was also a fan of the variety of the scenario design, to borrow, sort of video game technology. There was no shortage of unique, different encounters, so to speak, that occur in the book between different characters at different moments within different parts of the world. The book never felt like it spun its gears in any way. It always found a way to push forward into that next event, into the next encounter, into the next interesting set piece. Whatever it is that you've got going on, there's always another thing that's about to come that is different from all of the other things that came before. So you never feel like it's repetitive in that sort of sense, which is definitely a very good thing because, as we'll talk a little bit later, repetitiveness is maybe something that could have been a problem, but as far as the plotting, quote unquote, and all of that kind of stuff, there's not any of that repetition that is going to bother people. I think, at least that was my experience with the book anyway. So the variety definitely kept things from getting monotonous in what easily could have been monotonous given the state of the journey. And so, generally speaking, all of these things just combined to make a very unique and memorable experience for me with this book. But personal enjoyment aside, right, there are a couple of things that hold The Heart of the Nhaga back. Most of these are from a relatively technical perspective. I think that there are a notable amount of prose and sort of explanatory redundancies. Like I said, the repetitiveness in encounter or scenario design, again, to use video game terminology, is something that could have been a problem in this book if it wasn't done so well, because the prose and whatnot is a little bit repetitive in certain ways. It's not the most egregious thing that I've ever read, but it is something that is worth noting, even if it might probably be an artifact mostly of the translation of the book. Basically, this is of course Korean, translated from Korean into English. We'll talk a little bit more about the state of translation a little bit later in this video. Some other things that, might be a little bit hit or miss depending on the person is that certain aspects of the world and culture building, like I said, that I don't even know if I really hinted at this properly earlier. There are certain aspects of the culture and world building that might be a little bit over-explained to some certain degree, not in like an exposition dump sort of way. That is definitely not a problem with Heart of the Nhaga, but sort of in an in case you forgot kind of way, where you feel like, yes, I already know that detail about that thing. We don't need to use that, basically, that terminology again, for the fifth time in this book, basically. And, similar to that previous point that I talked about with regard to redundancies and repetitiveness, I think that part of this problem is probably an artifact of the translation, rather than, some objective problem with the actual storytelling itself. It's hard to be sure, but it is something to keep an eye out on. I think that if you are sensitive to, also, kind of along that same point that I was talking about earlier, some of the other things that I liked, the variety of stuff that is on display within the book. If you are sensitive for whatever reason to variety, for what seems like variety's sake, you may not have the most fun with this, because, there's plenty of moments within this book that you're not really knowing the objective purpose behind each scene in the moment that they're happening in certain cases. If that's something that bothers you, you might struggle with the book a little bit. If you feel like, certain events are just like ideas being thrown at the wall, that might be something that you latch onto in the book. Heck, even if you want certain events to feel a little bit more interconnected rather than like a sort of quasi-episodic type of thing going on in certain moments of the journey. I obviously found the variety on display very enjoyable. Some people might find it a bit more meandering, and that meandering point is going to be a little bit more relevant to like the biggest problem with the book. I think the biggest objective weakness of it is that Heart of the Nhaga is very anticlimactic. Now, that it seems to be very much by design, but again, it's definitely worth noting. I've seen it put in a couple places like Goodreads reviews, for example, that this is structured somewhat like Book of the New Sun, and I don't make that comparison because I've read Book of the New Sun, because I haven't read it, but I've seen some people make the comparison that this is basically one larger narrative that just happens to have been split, more or less arbitrarily into 4 volumes, basically. And I can't speak to the veracity of that kind of claim for Book of the New Sun, but I have heard it put a lot. That is definitely true for Heart of the Nhaga, however. The active plot of the book doesn't really build up to unique climax within this individual volume. It's not really doing its own thing insofar as you read the book and you feel like you got a story that is, in some sense complete, right? Like I said, it's anticlimactic. It doesn't build towards anything specific within this volume. It is definitely just one step of a much larger journey. So if you can't abide something by that, you'll either need to wait for the full series to be published in English, if you're an English reader, for example, or you may want to give the full series a skip. I know some people who have read like the first book of the New Sun, for example, and been very underwhelmed by what that was, and then just dropped the whole thing because it didn't really do much of its own journey, supposedly. And I think that might be a reaction that some people will have to Heart of the Nhaga. They'll get to the end and be like, that's it? Like, what was that even doing? And it is definitely the case that this is just one part of a larger journey. So, yeah, like I said, that is the biggest weakness of the book. I think it's by design. I don't think it's that much of a problem. Just obviously, if you're going to give this book a shot, do know that about it going into it ahead of time. As for the ugly, this is where we're going to talk a little bit more specifically about the state of the translation of the book, and it is in the ugly here because it's not like a good or bad. There's a little bit of nuance to this conversation. It's a weird topic to talk about with regard to the book and the series, and that is because I don't think that the translation is bad. The translator himself is not a bad translator. I don't think he's translated a handful of other notable Korean books in the past. the reason why this translation is a little difficult to talk about is because I have reason to believe that Korean is, one of the more especially difficult languages to translate into English, and even amongst, that category of difficult languages to translate into English, it might be more difficult than, say, like Japanese, for example, because it's like more, not niche isn't necessarily the correct term, but like there's less coming out of Korea that is being, brought into the English speaking world, for example, compared to Japanese media, which is a lot more prevalent. And so like Korea just might not have that much of a translation. I don't even know, like industry is not the right term, but you probably understand what I'm trying to get at here. As such, it's kind of worth noting that for The Bird That Drinks Tears here, there's no small amount of relatively clunky writing in there. Some of the redundancies, some of the repetitiveness, I chalked up to potentially being an artifact of the translation more so than a problem with the book itself, as in I'm not sure what translations into other languages would be, let alone what the original looks like. I don't know if it's repetitive or redundant or anything like that in those cases. Certainly it is the case in the English translation, however. There's also definitely an aspect of some lack of polish post-translation, like in the line editing side of things. There are plenty of pretty notable and obvious mistakes, sentences that are like, I did clock a couple of sentences here and there within the book that were like, this sentence just used almost an identical clause like 3 times in 3 paragraphs. There are ways to cut down on that kind of thing just from a technical perspective that isn't going to reduce, the quality of the translation. In fact, it's going to improve the quality of the translation because it's not going to be as distracting to an English reader. So if we're speaking within the context of translation from a very literal translation, like word for word translation, versus a more free-flowing, spirit-catching translation, this seems very much to fall along the side of a word-for-word literal translation, if I were to guess, and that's probably why some of those clunky mannerisms occur in there, right? So as such, there are several like awkward moments within the book. The certain word choices crop up now and again that's a little bit strange. That redundancy and similar issues that I brought up have talked about quite a bit. As an editor, I would have done a little bit more to clean up the English side of this prose because it is, a little bit messy in certain places. But this is the reason why I'm putting this in the ugly and not either the good or the bad, is because this is the first translation of this series into English, and it's not like you could expect another translation or a better translation to necessarily come out at any time at all, let alone in the nearish future, right? It's better for there to be a somewhat awkward or a somewhat janky English translation than for there to be no translation at all. I enjoyed my time with this book, especially with some of the ideas, the world building, the culture building, that kind of stuff, most especially, enough that like I'm totally willing to forgive a relatively messy translation or a messy general writing style of the book, in the English anyway, because it was worth reading, right? So that's what the ugly ultimately is, and that's where we're going to move into the recommendation. My recommendation of this book basically comes down to that translation context versus, what it is doing, right? I think that the ideas, the world building, the culture, etc. is definitely great and worth reading the book for. The conceit of the plot has a lot of potential that I'm ready to see more of moving into future books of the series. In essence, I recommend Heart of the Nhaga and hope to continue to recommend The Bird That Drinks Tears, the continuance of the series, but basically on 2 conditions. The first one of those is obviously that if you can't abide that lack of climax and resolution, maybe hold off for the further entries to be published so that you can read it all closer to one thing rather than as individual entries. And the second one of those is that if you really care about prose and need something pretty pristine, you will probably struggle with this book. I didn't, there were tons of moments where like I just had certain sentences or certain phrases or whatever pop up to me just like, that is not necessarily the best way to put that or whatever, but like I said, a janky translation is better than no translation, especially when some of the stuff that's going on in here is as cool and interesting as it is. So I do broadly recommend Heart of the Nhaga and The Bird That Drinks Tears so far. I can't say I regret checking it out at all. I'm looking forward to more. I'm going to read the next book pretty soon after it comes out, but definitely be aware of, you know, some of those things when you go into it. I know, you know, translation can definitely have a big effect on someone enjoying something or not, even within, say, like a bunch of classics literary fiction, for example. There are certain authors, certain books that, like, one translation of that book can be like the worst thing you've ever read, but a different translation of it can be the best thing you've ever read. I've seen that kind of stark difference between certain things. There's only one English translation of this book. There probably will only be one English translation of the book. So, you know, if you're interested in the conceit as I was, I recommend checking it out, but do be aware of some of the clunkiness of it at the same time. So that's basically how I'm going to end this review. Thank you for watching it if you did. If you are somebody else who has checked this out, let me know what you think of it. Are you going to pick up the second book when it comes out in late January? Like I said, I plan to do so. I'll probably read it in February, so basically, more or less expect a review for the second book, whatever it's called, Those Who Prepare the Way, probably in March of next year if I were to guess, assuming nothing goes wrong. But for now, I've been your host, King Crusoe. You can call me KC. Thank you one final time for watching, and I hope to see you guys in the next video.